Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, featuring Derek Lido speaking on his new book, The Entrepreneurs, The Relentless Quest for Value. My name is Srish Chatterjee, Professor of Finance at the Gabelli School of Business and Gabelli Chair for Global Security Analysis at Fordham University. On behalf of the Gabelli School, a very warm welcome to all of you. In the last several years, the Gabelli Center and our wonderful co-presenters, the Museum of American Finance and the CFA Society of New York, have sponsored more than 50 events that have drawn more than 8,000 attendees. We are tremendously proud of this dynamic collaboration, and a full archive of our video content will be shared in the thank you note that you will receive. In light of today's webinar, let me add that the Fordham Foundry, Fordham's hub for innovation and entrepreneurship, is celebrating the 10th anniversary of its founding this year. The Foundry has helped more than 4,500 students and alumni from all of Fordham schools, including Fordham Law, the Graduate School of Social Services, Fordham College, and the Gabelli School of Business. In just a moment, David Cowan, President and CEO of the Museum of American Finance, will give a full introduction to our speaker. Let me take this opportunity to mention that in the spring semester, Fordham will offer a course in financial history named Booms, Bubbles, Busts, and Crashes. It will be taught by David Cowan, and he'll be joined by renowned economic historian and former board chair of the Museum of American Finance, Professor Richard Silla. Professor Lido will speak for about 40 minutes, at which point he will address questions submitted to the question field that is located below the video player. Please feel free to submit questions at any point during the event. We will be addressing as many of them as possible during the session. All attendees of today's event will receive digital copies of Professor Lido's book. And now I'm delighted to turn it over to my good friend David Cowan, President of the Museum of American Finance.
Thanks, Suresh. Great to see you and all of our friends again. And today we're going to learn that almost everything is entrepreneurial, and a lot of what you know about the topic is either misleading or just wrong. We will span the globe in both time and location with rich stories from history. From venture capital before Christ, abbreviated with the catchy phrase VCBC, to modern days, there are many memorable accounts in the book. From interpreting the mummified remains of an Alps man from thousands of years ago, to the wax figures in the museums of Madame Tussauds several hundred years ago, to the present-day household entrepreneurial names like Jobs and Zuckerberg. While you will know a few of the stories, most will be new and therefore quite refreshing. I also suggest checking out the bibliographic notes, as they will illuminate the depth and breadth of this scholarship. Our author today is the perfect person to relate this topic, as he is not just a professor, but an entrepreneur himself. He was the successful CEO of a global publicly traded semiconductor company and the founder and CEO of an innovative startup. His day job is aptly titled, quote unquote, professor of practice, or quote unquote, professor of the practice at Princeton University's Keller Center for Innovation and Engineering Education. This is his third book, and he has published more than 100 articles in on entrepreneurship and innovation. Today, in particular, Derek will focus on the intersection of entrepreneurship and financial innovation, its history, practical insights, consequences, and calls to action. It is therefore my pleasure to introduce Professor Derek Lido.
Well, thank you, Suresh and David. It is a great pleasure to be here today. Let me start with a question. Have you ever wondered what the world would be like if entrepreneurs didn't exist? Certainly, all the entrepreneurs depicted on the front cover of my book would not have existed. But it would also be a world without computers, smartphones, and streaming video. It would be a world without planes, trains, and automobiles. It would be a world without electricity, medical devices, and even most clothing. But it would also be a world without slavery, inequity, and inequality. It would be a world without most cancers, pollution, and climate change. Yep, entrepreneurs pack quite a punch. They impact your life in far more ways than you realize, in ways that make your life far better and, unfortunately, far worse. Yet, no one has taken a deep dive into their history, at least not until my new book. As an entrepreneur myself and a Princeton University professor who teaches entrepreneurship, I want to shine the light on people who have shaped our planet since ancient times. In doing this first of its kind research, I uncovered 3 key insights. Entrepreneurs are the world's greatest change agents, far more than governments, religions, and big business. Entrepreneurial innovation leads to unintended consequences that we often don't realize and even can threaten our existence. Throughout time, governments and rulers have been ineffective at controlling entrepreneurs and the unintended consequences of their innovation. But there are steps that we can take to lessen the harm and benefit from that innovation. And today, I'd like to focus on how this includes the benefits and harms caused by financial entrepreneurs. Before we take a closer look, I need to define what I mean by entrepreneur. To do that, let me take you back to how people lived 10,000 years ago in the Stone Age, and to a tribe that I'm showing here called the Trobriand Islanders. Note that the white anthropologist seated in the middle in this new slide is not a member of the tribe. So, how they lived together in small groups serves as a good and general example of how entrepreneurs first emerged. But we have to observe them for a long time to see anything we would recognize as an entrepreneur. Being an entrepreneur could be life-threatening. Stone Age tribes explicitly forbade entrepreneurial trade. All ancient cultures felt that someone who acted like an entrepreneur took advantage of others in their group for their own benefit. Popular myths and taboos made it clear that entrepreneurs would be murdered. Almost all of their trade was conducted under rigid rules. Think of it as ritual reciprocal gifting. So then, how does a Trobriand become an entrepreneur? It takes a lone individual who wanders away from the tribe, traveling for hours and carrying goods he or his mate made. Eventually, he'll encounter a few other individuals in the secluded clearing, each from a different tribe. They all have goods that they arrange in front of them. They're all nervous. There's a lot of hand motioning as they push some of their goods towards someone else's. That person pushes some of his goods to align with the other person's. Both individuals then take out and put in goods in the middle ground as they feverishly gesticulate. At some point, one individual takes the goods, another is put in the middle, turns, and walks away. This scene would be typical of how Stone Age entrepreneurs traded with strangers far away, where they could run away. The Trobriand Islanders, who I profile in my book, called this type of trade gimwali, and it was considered very bad behavior. Gimwali-like trading is the only kind of Stone Age trade that anthropologists have ever observed that we can recognize as entrepreneurial. This scene illustrates three key elements that describe all entrepreneurs in any time period and any culture. An entrepreneur is someone who is self-directed in providing for him or herself, practices skills that produce things others want and value, and captures this value by enticing others to offer their valuables in exchange. This is a powerful definition because it is timeless, universal, and unbiased. You can use it to determine any entrepreneurial activity anywhere in the world, including in the ancient rubble found in archaeological excavations. Consider the financial sector. Entrepreneurial activity has been the driving force behind the evolution of finance. It's been the driving force behind financial revolutions. And no doubt, entrepreneurial activity will determine our financial future. Let me illustrate with three examples near and dear to all of our hearts: mortgages, venture capital, and banking. Today, there is over $25 trillion of mortgages outstanding around the world. This is a huge number. In 2008, this market caused the near collapse of the world economy. In the late 1980s and early 90s, 1/3 of all the US savings and loan institutions went bust and had to be bailed out by taxpayers. How entrepreneurs built the mortgage market has loads to teach us about how to make these products more robust and beneficial. Mortgages can trace their origins to Mesopotamia 4,500 years ago. And at that time, there were already lots of entrepreneurs there. And here's sort of a decent reconstruction of how entrepreneurs introduced the mortgage. Some wealthy entrepreneur noticed that the government had begun seizing the homes and lands of people who failed to pay their taxes on time, requiring the family to work for the government to pay off their debt. This innovative entrepreneur decides to loan money to a couple of people in this situation. Great idea for those struggling. They keep a roof over their heads, keep their lands, and have their debts paid. But here's the catch. The entrepreneur requires in writing that the people repay the loan with compounding interest, no less, by a set time. And if they don't, they'll give the entrepreneur their home and lands and work for him. Voila, the mortgage is invented by Mesopotamian entrepreneurs around 2400 BC. We know this because we have descriptions of mortgage contracts from the time period. But this is only the beginning. Other wealthy entrepreneurs in the city hear about what's happened. They decide this could work for them too. And they offer something similar to people they know who are behind on their taxes. Then it begins to snowball. Other successful people who are not entrepreneurs decide they can benefit from offering someone a mortgage. Soon, within 50 years, many hundreds of people have signed mortgage contracts. I'm sure you can guess what happens next. Many of these people lose their homes, become debt slaves. Mortgage entrepreneurs are now the wealthiest people in their cities. They have the largest land holdings and the most slaves. This story illustrates 4 timeless characteristics of entrepreneurial behavior. First, entrepreneurs swarm. They exhibit this collective behavior because they copy one another's successes, just as bees from a certain hive swarm on a nearby cup of sugar water. They always have, and they always will. Second, swarming results in the impact of an initial innovation multiplying many-fold. Unfortunately, third, swarms also amplify the impact of the unintended consequences of their innovations. Let me extend this story in time to gain a fourth insight on how entrepreneurial swarms are hives of innovation. After entrepreneurs began offering mortgages, some of them became wealthier than those in power. Plus, the reduction in free citizens meant rulers could not raise large enough armies. This provoked a response, and rulers began issuing edicts. All unpaid debts are forgiven, everyone is freed from debt slavery, and all lands are restored to their original owners. Wham! The entrepreneurs take a huge hit financially, but most are still in business. They regroup and they offer mortgages again. But now they require the borrower to adopt them into their family so future edicts will not apply to them. The cycle repeats with lots of loans and lots of families having to work for their adopted sons for the rest of their lives. After another several decades, another round of edicts are issued, and entrepreneurs figure out workarounds for whatever new rules are associated with those edicts. I show here an example of one such edict from 1662 BC that even threatened entrepreneurs that unfairly seized lands with death. The cycle continues till today. Mortgage contracts are no longer written on clay tablets. We don't have debt slaves, at least not here in the US. Nobody's going to face the death penalty, but large numbers of people are still losing their homes with crippling debts that destroy their lives. Mortgage innovations, almost always introduced by an entrepreneur, continue to cause financial crises for governments, their taxpayers, and not to mention those who should not have been offered mortgages in the first place and find themselves homeless. A cat and mouse game between entrepreneurs enticing people to accept asset-backed loans and governments attempting to regulate these loans has been playing out virtually unbroken for over 4,000 years. The fourth insight from the history of entrepreneurial mortgages is that swarms are hives of innovation. The way innovation works in the swarm is that entrepreneurs are constantly watching one another. They copy what caused someone else to be successful. But everyone adds their personalization even as they copy, maybe something about how it's delivered or how it's made or some other facet of value creation. Some of this personalization is perceived as successful by other entrepreneurs. And that particular feature or practice is then widely copied in the swarm, setting a new basis on which the next improvements are made. In this way, innovations build upon one another in swarms and deliver us innovations for which we change our lives to adopt. Matter of fact, when you consider entrepreneurs as a group through history, they are the biggest sources of change we live with. And we've not understood that till now. A final insight. Entrepreneurs are always effective getting around rules and regulations. Governments, even autocratic ones, are ineffective at controlling entrepreneurs. And they are ineffective in dealing with the unintended consequences caused by their entrepreneurs. The general population is virtually always left to deal with entrepreneurial unintended consequences. One of the most surprising findings in my book concerns venture capital, a very exciting part of the finance industry. VCs help stimulate the growth of new ideas and create immense amounts of wealth. The history of entrepreneurship is also the history of venture capital. And the story of the evolution of venture capital points to how the field is likely to develop. It starts 4,000 years ago. If you could read Babylonian cuneiform writing, this ancient tablet that's located at the University of Pennsylvania is a contract forming a 7-year limited liability partnership for the purposes of investing in new copper import businesses. At the time, bronze tools had become finally affordable, thanks to entrepreneurs. Big money could be made importing and trading copper and tin materials. E.A. Nazir is the venture capitalist who created this specific limited liability partnership. It has 51 limited partners. E.A. Nazir had been a copper trader himself, so he knew the business and he knew who were the young caravan managers around Ur who had the savvy to be running their own businesses. Other Mesopotamian tablets describe similar limited liability partnerships. In northern Mesopotamia, the partnerships were typically 10 years long, with profits split along the limited and general partners, 2/3 to the limited and 1/3 to the general. I note that contemporary venture capital funds are usually configured as 10-year limited liability partnerships with 20% general partner participation and 2% in annual fees. I note if such a fund doubles the investor's money in 10 years, the profits would also be split about 1/3, 2/3. The modern venture capital industry merely rediscovered what had been developed 4,000 years ago. I wish I had more time to trace the development of venture capital as I describe in detail in the book, but I can summarize the evolution as follows. Venture capital started as a partnership arrangement for entrepreneurial acquaintances to invest in capable colleagues. It evolved step by step through the ages into entrepreneurs collecting funds from a limited number of strangers for them to invest in a limited number of strangers who aspire to scale their companies. Sometime in the not too distant future, an enterprising entrepreneur is going to figure out how to train on artificial intelligence to pick startups at least as well as the best VCs. This will transform these partnership structures into large funds, where lots of strangers can invest in lots of strangers founding companies with vastly reduced fees. Now let's go back 2,500 years to look at another entrepreneurial innovation in finance that keeps on evolving to this day: banking. Today in the US, banks have close to $23 trillion of assets on their balance sheets. The economy would collapse if banks collapsed. Athens, around 450 BC, was in the middle of an entrepreneurial golden age as entrepreneurial silver mining and the import and export of luxury goods was thriving, spurred on by the creation of standardized coinage. Athenians were quickly accumulating lots of coins. A few already wealthy Athenian entrepreneurs realized that money could be made taking deposits and exchanging foreign coins for Athenian ones. As depicted in this artist's rendering, in just a few years, a swarm formed and there were lots of banks in Athens. What started in Athens eventually morphed through countless small innovations through Roman, Venetian, Florentine, English, and American entrepreneurs into our modern day banks. Most our banks since Athenian times were founded by an entrepreneur. Today's big established banks, no longer controlled by their founding entrepreneurs, watch what new generation of banking entrepreneurs do to create new demand for banking products. Typical of how big businesses operate, they then copy what works. Mobile banking, peer-to-peer financing, buy now, pay later, digital asset deposits and asset management, loans based off of digital assets, less expensive ways to transfer large sums or to make payments, are just a few examples of recent entrepreneurial swarms that have formed around banking innovations. Who will lead in metaverse banking? Not Citicorp, but maybe someone from Fordham. But I hope whomever pioneers metaverse banking will consider the potential unintended consequences of their actions, because there could be many, including new ways to destroy someone's credit and new forms of criminal activity. All these major entrepreneurial innovation oopses cost us money. Not just the people who may have lost a deposit or had the house foreclosed. Entrepreneurs have been directly responsible for the innovations that resulted in food adulteration, most forms of pollution, inequity, and workplace injury. Not to mention the 60 million people around the world who are still slaves. Entrepreneurs have caused almost all the deforestation, provided the innovations that can cause our climate to change, and also provide the enticements that cause obesity and addictions. Taxpayers bailed out the small depositors in the savings and loan, and bailed out big banks and insurance companies during the Great Recession. We pay for this directly in both higher taxes, but also as hidden social taxes. Homeowners and renters insurance costs way more than just a few years ago because insurance companies have had huge payouts for severe flooding aggravated by hydrocarbon emissions. These are unintended consequences instigated by the original oil entrepreneurs in the Gilded Age, like John D. Rockefeller. No government has effectively held their entrepreneurs accountable for all or even most of the unintended consequences of their actions. They only try to do so after the unintended consequences become political anchors. Then they proceed to regulate ineffectively because, one, governments have not understood how entrepreneurship actually works, and two, rulers and government officials are afraid of losing the benefits of entrepreneurial innovations and wealth creation. Government ineffectiveness in dealing with entrepreneurial unintended consequences has meant that the burden of mitigating these consequences has always fallen onto the general population. This means we pay for the cost of type 2 diabetes and for people dying from lung cancer with higher insurance costs. We pay taxes to clean up beaches of plastic and to deal with the addicted and the families that have lost their homes. But we also pay higher insurance premiums because of the climate changes set off by entrepreneurial innovations of the last century. I estimate that the out-of-pocket costs associated with entrepreneurial unintended consequences for a family of average income to be at least $2,500 a year. And that includes even with the employer picking up most of the health insurance increases. Let me hopefully anticipate a question you're thinking. How can we change our relationship with entrepreneurs for everyone's benefit? Imagine a world where people knew what to expect from entrepreneurs. They would be savvy about the true benefits of entrepreneurial innovation and wary about hidden social taxes they may be forced to pay. It is very possible to create such a world. A little education would go a long way in helping everyone understand how much we're being directed by entrepreneurs. Short teaching modules about how entrepreneurship shapes our world and our lives, delivered in about the 4th and 11th grade, would make high school grads savvier in deciding which products they want to buy and which are not so secretly going to cost them. A little transparency would help us as adults stay aware of potential consequences. We could then be better supporters of entrepreneurs who want to make the world a better place. We just need our entrepreneurs to post their own analysis of the potential adverse consequences of their products and services. Entrepreneurs that were not honest would face big consumer backlashes. As I described in my introduction, without entrepreneurs, our lives would be very dull and short. We do not acknowledge our entrepreneurs enough for that. If we recognize the achievements of our entrepreneurs, big and small, who improve well-being and take responsibility for unintended consequences of their actions, many entrepreneurs will take more responsibility for their actions. Specifically, many entrepreneurs would aspire to be elected to a National Academy of Entrepreneurs. Membership would have similar prestige to being a member of our National Academy of Sciences. The desire to be officially revered for their accomplishments will make almost all entrepreneurs more thoughtful of the consequences of their actions. This could even be enacted at a city and state level. Finally, we should expect our entrepreneurs to pay for any costs the government or public have to bear to mitigate the unintended consequences of their actions. It turns out that entrepreneurs could be stimulated to provide these mitigation services much less expensively than governments or big businesses. In closing, entrepreneurs, including all types of financial entrepreneurs, play the biggest role in determining how we live our lives, as well as our financial futures. How entrepreneurship works merits our attention. It's the Federal Reserve and Congress that must grapple with the myriad of financial innovations constantly introduced by entrepreneurs, not vice versa. My book makes it clear that entrepreneurial innovations always have unintended consequences. I promise you that the unintended consequences of peer-to-peer lending and digital currencies, which we're already starting to feel, are just the beginning. There are many more down the road. It does not mean that we should ban entrepreneurial innovations, financial or otherwise. But it does mean we should expect peer-to-peer lending entrepreneurs to reflect on potential adverse consequences of their actions and alert us to them before they build into political storms. My research shows that the Federal Reserve, the SEC, Congress, and other government institutions will take their time to issue rules and regulations concerning our latest entrepreneurial financial innovations. And when they do, they'll provide minimal protections. The protections will spur new cycles of innovations to get around those rules. That's just how entrepreneurs work. This is how it always has been for millennia. So we need to change how we deal with entrepreneurs, because if we do not, our planet will be harmed irreparably by the unintended consequences of their actions. But we do not need big radical change. The good news is we just need a minor course correction. Now that we finally understand how entrepreneurship really works, we know how to entice entrepreneurial action to be more beneficial, and to actually mitigate many of its existential challenges. It just takes a little education, more transparency, some recognition. That will go a long, long way towards aligning entrepreneurial behaviors to improve well-being, equity, and sustainability. My book describes entrepreneurial impacts far beyond finance. And I think you'll find those stories equally interesting. I hope you'll read the book. By reading the book, you can figure out how to improve both the world as well as your own financial futures. And if anyone's interested in helping to further educate the public or to set up more prestigious recognition for our good entrepreneurs, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Derek. That was very good presentation. Lots of thought-provoking ideas. We do have some questions. Let me start with a question coming from Howard Bloom. He's saying, do you distinguish between entrepreneurs who function as independents versus those who have or who take control through a corporate structure?
So that's an excellent question. Of course, the word entrepreneurship is in today's world means almost anything to anybody. And today, the word entrepreneur is often associated with the related word intrapreneur, which refers to somebody who's innovative within a corporate context. If you look back at the history of entrepreneurship, though, there is definite difference between how entrepreneurs that are acting for themselves in a self-directed manner and those that are acting at the behest of some hierarchical structure. Maybe big business, but it also could be governments or NGOs or other enterprises. And how they innovate is a very different set of steps. So it's in our best interest, actually, to make that distinction very clear. The entrepreneur is different from the intrapreneur. My book studies the entrepreneurs. It makes note of when big business split from entrepreneurial businesses and became a different, distinct way of creating value. And big business operates very differently from entrepreneurial businesses. And it's really very powerful to understand that distinction because it's very useful in understanding when and how things happen in the world and who's responsible for what. So anyway, thank you for the question, but we have to keep entrepreneurs as a distinct, separate category and distinct from entrepreneurs.
I just want to encourage the audience, please submit your questions. Marco asks, entrepreneurs from a cognitive science point, is it a universal, phenomenon? I mean, is it once an entrepreneur, in my words, always an entrepreneur? And is that true of time and location?
So I think it's independent of time, location, culture. So in my book, I didn't talk about it in the talk, but I identify distinctly entrepreneurial behaviors in hunter-gatherers. But before any social hierarchy or political economy is formed, right? So before society has any structure whatsoever, you have these individuals or these very small family groups that are creating these products literally to exchange, to entice other small groups to exchange something that they want, like sheep and goats or other food products or jewelry. Jewelry is what I noted that this one tribe in eastern Jordan was making 9,000 years ago. in a very entrepreneurial fashion. So entrepreneurial behaviors are very primal. They're primal because some people just do not want to be part of the pack, and that they are willing to take risks and follow their own set of rules by providing for themselves in how they want to. And then necessarily needing to entice people to exchange with them. This is true. We think of entrepreneurship as an outgrowth of capitalism or democracy, and yet it predates any ism, any culture, and you find it operating in exactly the same way all around the world. So it's very powerful to understand how it works, because it's making lots of changes all the time, and we have no choice but to accept these changes that entrepreneurs foist on us.
I think Suresh cut off, so I'll go to the next one from John Landry. Why does the U.S. seem more entrepreneurial than the rest of the world?
Well, as I note in the book, from the very instance that Europeans set foot on this continent, the vast majority of them, the vast majority of them were entrepreneurs. They had to be very self-directed and independent. They had to, be responsible for creating their own value. They had to engage and entice others to exchange with them, including the indigenous populations that were here already long before them on this continent. So when America finally, breaks free from England, it is a far more entrepreneurial culture than the England where most of the settlers have come from. And the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and our founding documents, if you look into the names of the signatories on those documents, the vast majority of those people are entrepreneurs. These are documents that put very few constraints on commerce and entrepreneurial behavior. Very distinct from what was true in Europe, where these societies had formed and nobility had certain, benefits that others didn't, and there were constraints, a lot more constraints on being an entrepreneur. In America didn't. And so entrepreneurship developed in America a unique characteristic. It was far more competitive, in some ways far more brutal. And yet that lack of constraint allowed the entrepreneurs in America to be far more innovative, because the swarms had fewer constraints. There was prestige about copying one another, ideas in a different part of the country, and being recognized as the most successful person in the town or village. So those things spurred on entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs spur innovation no matter what. So that's why we look to American forms of entrepreneurship as benchmarks today. That doesn't mean they're going to be benchmarks forever, because I think as now we understand entrepreneurship better, we can replicate these fertile places where swarms can proliferate, and thereby proliferate, major innovations. Those can happen anywhere. China's getting good at that. There are a lot of places. India's getting good at that. So there's nothing sacred about it being an American, form of value creation. It's really not.
Okay, I don't see Suresh, so I'm going to keep going. We always get this question. We do have a fair number of students. It's going to be about crypto and the metaverse. But Professor Kelly frames it: if government cannot be expected to regulate cryptocurrencies effectively, who can? And then how do you feel about the unintended consequences of crypto and NFTs, some of them being the utilization of all the power to mine and other areas? And any general thoughts you might have on the topic?
Well, I didn't, have time to really discuss it in the, in my prepared remarks. But if you read the book, the most effective group at regulating entrepreneurs are other entrepreneurs. There are some, infamous scenes of what Cornelius Vanderbilt did in his setting the rules of how entrepreneurship worked in, the 1840s to the 1870s, and entrepreneurs really had to take notice of how Cornelius Vanderbilt stipulated competition should work, and it was very no holds barred. But you had no choice. These were the rules as set by Cornelius Vanderbilt. These rules were then adjusted quite a bit by John D. Rockefeller with some of the things that he did, most notably the Cleveland Massacre, where he bought up most of his competitors in Cleveland in a period of about 2 months or 3 months, and was very aggressive, let's say, in doing so, and how that set another set of rules for how to compete, which again were then adjusted when J.P. Morgan bought out Andrew Carnegie and bought out these entrepreneurs to form these larger conglomerates, corporations that were then run by professional managers. Professional managers and big businesses has dominated how governments have thought about to regulate commerce and business. But because of that, governments have ignored how entrepreneurs have worked. That said, entrepreneurs don't ignore how entrepreneurs work. And the bottom line is that entrepreneurs would probably be much better at regulating entrepreneurial activity. And under the right circumstances, I believe that entrepreneurs would do a better job for everybody involved, not just to serve their best interests, but to serve the interests of where they live and their cultures as a whole. So I think there is plenty to discuss about how to make entrepreneurs more responsible for their actions and the actions of their colleagues. I'm not sure I got to the second part of that. Maybe if you could repeat that. what dimensions of crypto you want me to talk about.
Yeah, just well, there are unintended consequences with crypto, and I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts. Are you pro crypto NFTs? Are you anti? Are you neutral? And is it just another piece of entrepreneurial foresight and innovation and engineering?
I think it's another form of entrepreneurial innovation. Okay, so an innovation, what's an innovation? An innovation is when somebody, doesn't have to be an entrepreneur, comes forward with an idea or a product or a service that some group accepts as a new best practice. That's an innovation. Okay. Now, it turns out that entrepreneurs are much better at innovation than any other groups. So the vast majority of all innovation will come from entrepreneurs. It will forever come from entrepreneurs. Okay. And so entrepreneurs are delivering to groups what they want, and they're excited about cryptocurrencies and assigning value to scarcity of all sorts, not just not just um, old-fashioned, let's say, market supply and demand type of values. So yeah, no, we have to accept cryptocurrencies and NFTs and the like. Now, what will they continue to be an exciting, vibrant market? Probably not in the existing form. The swarm is already being, filtered to a very great extent by the volatility in what people are finding valuable or exciting about NFTs and cryptocurrencies. But as we've seen in what I talked about in mortgages and the like, the entrepreneurs are going to respond to this volatility. They're going to respond to, NFT 1.0 not being all that exciting after all. And they'll have NFT 2.0, or it might be NFX 10.0, I don't know. But we can count on those crypto swarms and those NFT swarms that already exist. We can count on a lot more innovation coming out of them in the not too distant future.
Cerise, you're back.
Thank you for asking the question. Sorry, something happened with my connection. I don't know how many of these questions from our audience have already been asked, but Derek, I have a question of my own, which goes back to your example of mortgage and banks. And you mentioned when you were going over the mortgage example, which was more than 2000 years BC, that various people, and you were talking about the swarming of entrepreneurs, how other people came into the field, and then it all ended in some kind of a disaster to be started again. And it's so similar to what happened with us just a few years ago in the mortgage market. Then you talked about banking. And the question that comes to my mind as a follow-up with that mortgage example is, did you see in your research bank runs? That's something that modern day scholars always talk about. This year's Nobel Prize went to people who talked about how to stop bank runs and the whole importance of deposit insurance and things like that. I'm just very curious what you found in the history.
There have been an enormous number of bank runs. We tend to be focused on the U.S. and U.S. history, but bank runs are very common on a global scale, and are phenomena because that again demonstrate that governments, particularly when you combine them with bigger businesses that are no longer entrepreneurial, are just not very good at understanding what regulations to put in place to lessen that. Yes, depository insurance and things like that have helped, but there's still a lot of latitude, particularly outside the U.S., where there are even more bank runs per year than inside the U.S. That enable too much manipulation of the reserves and the deposits and the like, that then cause these losses of confidence in banks that result in runs. I think that if we look at banks more as an entrepreneurial phenomenon and not as sort of like a big business structural phenomena, that there are additional things that we could do to further stabilize and reduce the frequency of these bank runs. But while you were off, there was another question about regulations and the like, where I mentioned that, entrepreneurs historically have been better at regulating the behaviors of their fellow entrepreneurs than government regulations have, or even autocratic rulers have. And so I think there's a lot of potential there for banking innovation. If it was in entrepreneurs' best interest, that they could help there.
So we know you gave some definitions of an entrepreneur early on. Henry McGowan wants to know, though, are there 3 topic traits of an entrepreneur based on some of the most successful ones you've seen? Any qualities that you can tell us about of the successful ones that you saw?
Right. So it is this independence, this self-directedness, this determined focus that yields the most successful entrepreneurs. And we can see that in contemporary entrepreneurs too. I mean, we don't have to go back 9,000 years. We can see that in Bezos and Zuckerberg. They're very independent and very determined people. And they decide what rules to follow and what rules not to follow. Right? They break rules, and that's what successful entrepreneurs do. They tend to be very, aware of what a lot of people want from them. So they do have connection with their potential customers or customers. So they can't just be, disconnected or naive about, where the demand is going to come from. But boy, are they determined they're going to do whatever it takes to be successful.
Suresh, you got the last question.
Okay, my question actually goes back to something that was already touched upon and somebody else asked, but I'm going to ask it a slightly different way. This is about corporate structure again. So in the past, we found that an entrepreneur might start something himself or herself, try to have a startup, build a startup. Then after a certain point, for a variety of reasons, maybe a corporation will come and acquire that startup. And now we are finding also corporations following a different model, having their own innovative activities, sort of not just the standard R&D, but also incubation and things like that. They're trying to sort of replicate this whole entrepreneurial model within their own structure, starting the entrepreneurial activities, innovation activities within their their structure. I don't know what's your take on that particular transition.
Well, I've had experience with that, personal experience, both when I was running the major semiconductor company and we bought entrepreneurial organizations, and then when I did my startup and I sold it to a big business. Uh, and it is almost impossible for big businesses to create the lack of constraints that leads to this self-direction, this self-directedness that creates, the innovations. And, the big businesses can be part of swarms, but they're very, 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 very rarely on the leading edge, on the sort of design horizon of a swarm. They're the followers. They're watching what the entrepreneurs do, and they're deciding, okay, this is our time to do that. And so when they buy a startup, or when they create this division and they even put it away from headquarters so that they can do it their own way, they're still putting enough constraints on um, that group that they're trying to incubate, that they can't do it truly in an innovative fashion. They still have to meet the budget cycles. They still have to fly to headquarters and discuss how much money they can spend next quarter and the like. And they still have to promise to use the sales force or the purchasing department or accept these rigid processes as part of their innovations. And that's the dead weight on these in-house groups that ultimately don't make them as innovative as the real entrepreneurial organizations.
David, one more question just came in. Do you want to go with it? Just another 30 seconds?
I know the gentleman. He's an author himself on entrepreneurship, Howard Wolk. He wrote Launchpad Republic. So let's get it in. You note, he says the unintended consequences of entrepreneurs. Do you think these unintended consequences are more material than those of other innovators, such as large corporations or even scientists? How's their track record?
Oh, they're far more impactful. I mean, there's no comparison. So big businesses ultimately are very good at risk assessment. That's what the shareholders want and need, and they will take action if something is fails, and so we don't see anywhere near as many unintended consequences from a big business innovation. Governments, are pretty darn impactful, and they do have lots of unintended consequences. War and radiation from making nuclear weapons, and there's a lot there. But because there are no swarms involved with that sort of innovation, it's highly restricted and the like, that it doesn't get multiplied over and over and over again like it does with an entrepreneurial innovation. And that multiplication within the swarm, it multiplies the innovation. It means that we all get smartphones all that much faster, okay? Billions of them. But it also means that, all those children doing, lithium and rare earth mining, are being killed at a much greater rate. So no comparison. Entrepreneurial innovation dominates the world.
Derek and David and everybody in the audience, this has been a fascinating hour, but we are coming up on the time. So let me remind everybody to join us again in 2 weeks' time on November 1st when Terence Keeley will talk about moving beyond ESG to impact investing. And let me take the opportunity again, Derek. Thank you so much, David, as well as our partners in CFA. This has been very, very nice discussion. And thanks again. And see you next time.